This episode of Gators Breakdown is brought to you by MyBookie. Double your first deposit up to $1,000. Head to mybookie.ag and use promo code Gators to activate the offer. Bet, win, get paid at MyBookie.
Gators Breakdown, the Gators fan podcast, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SCC, getting you ready for Florida versus Tennessee, noon this Saturday in the Swamp. Joining me on this episode is Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor at Rocky Top Insider. He'll give us a look at the season so far for the Volunteers and the key matchups for the game. Remember, you can find Gators Breakdown on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. There you'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes. You can also find them at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. When using those services, please share, rate, and review the show. And on social media, follow Gators Breakdown on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. Later this week, catch a News4Jax exclusive, Talking with Troop, every week exclusively on news4jax.com. The former Gators tight end Ben Troop joins me once a week this season, and Ben brings it, gives his thoughts like only he can. Looking forward to seeing how he sees the Gators moving forward with Kyle Trask, Emory Jones at the quarterback position. Every week, exclusively this season on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor of Rocky Top Insider, joins me here on Gators Breakdown to preview the Tennessee Volunteers. Nathaniel, welcome to Gators Breakdown.
Hey, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, of course, we'll preview the Tennessee Volunteers here as they travel to Gainesville to the Swamp for Florida's first SEC matchup of the season at home. So, a disappointing start to the season with a huge upset loss to Georgia State, and then a hard-fought down-to-the-wire loss to a pretty good BYU team, and the Vols are sitting at 1-2, coming off a win to UT Chattanooga. While it has been a disappointing start, I'm sure Tennessee is viewing this Florida game as a redemption game and a moment where they can turn the season around.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a game where I think Florida's a good team. I don't think they're a top 10 team. They're definitely beatable. We've seen that. I think you'd admit it too, David. We've seen that in the first two big games of Florida season. Obviously, discounting UT Martin, but they looked very beatable against Miami, and they looked very beatable against Kentucky. This is a game where, with it being a noon kickoff on the road and stuff too, and I think Tennessee, specifically a quarterback with Garrett Garantano, I think he tends to play better on the road. I think Tennessee's team last season in certain games played better on the road than they did at home. So I think a lot of fans would, I don't know, they wouldn't totally forget what happened in the beginning of the season with Georgia, and then also losing a heartbreaker to BYU. They wouldn't totally forget that if Tennessee came out and got the upset against Florida, but a lot of fans would be willing to at least forgive it. They wouldn't forgive it. They would forgive the beginning if Tennessee comes out and does something they haven't done since 2003, and that would be getting a win down the Swamp.
Now then, from the Florida side of things, and looking at the fan base, of course, with the emergence of Florida-LSU rivalry, and then, of course, Florida playing Miami this year, and Florida-Georgia, Florida State, and, Florida's recent streak against Tennessee, Florida fans kind of dismissed this Tennessee game. Of course, it's nowhere near what it was in the 90s and early 2000s with Spurrier and Fulmer. So this kind of, on the Florida side of things, the rivalries kind of fell by the wayside, maybe even dropped behind Florida and LSU. From the Tennessee side of things, of course, I know it's a little bit different when you go on a losing streak like that. Is this still, of course, Alabama's up there too, but is this still one of the top, if not the top, one of the top two rivalries for Tennessee?
Absolutely. I think most fans you have, especially some of the older fans will say Alabama is number one, and I wouldn't argue that's been a storied rivalry for decades, and Florida was more of a new one that started in the 90s when you had the expansion and the split into divisions in the SEC. But Vol fans, I think, by and large, they'll still have Florida, if not number one, number two, as far as most hated rivals on the football field. And I think you're getting more and more people who would put Georgia up there just because Georgia is finally, playing up to their standard, playing up to expectations of what they, they've looked like a sleeping giant for a long time. It does seem like Kirby Smart kind of tap it into that a little bit more. So I think you're seeing more fans throw in there to, Georgia maybe number 2 or ahead of Florida, but I still think for the most part you have Alabama and Florida are the most hated teams by Vol fans. It's interesting with, you mentioned with the huge streak that Florida had, and that even still Tennessee breaks that streak in 2016, but they've lost the last 2. So you've had Florida winning, I think it's 13 of the last 14 games against Tennessee. With that happening, and with, a lot of those games being kind of dominating victories too by the Gators, you've seen with Tennessee being as down as they have, teams like South Carolina and Missouri and Vanderbilt really kind of become rivals for Tennessee, just because Tennessee's been so down that those teams have started to get victories against the Vols, and those series have become a lot more competitive. So I'll be, it's been a very interesting past 5 to 10 years to really watch how things have changed for Tennessee because of how down they've been, and these teams that Tennessee's historically dominated and hasn't had an issue with become more rivals than what they maybe you can say what they should have been because of how bad Tennessee's been. But no, I still think the fans especially and the players too still very much have a deep-seated hatred of the Gators.
All right, let's get to these players a little bit as they come to Gainesville. And coming into the season, quarterback Jarrett Guarantano, it was one of those SEC quarterbacks where we were looking at taking that next step, much like we kind of viewed Felipe Franks as well. How has his progression played out to this point in the season?
It's been disappointing. You look at the stat sheet. If you haven't watched the games that Tennessee's played against Georgia State or against BYU, you can discount kind of what he did against UTC. That's an FCS school. But I thought he'd have a nice bounce back performance against them. But if you look at the stat sheet, you're going to say, hey, he's not been terrible. He's completed 60-something% of his passes for 7 touchdowns, only 2 interceptions, and a decent amount of yardage, especially considering he only played one half against UTC. But when you watch the way he played against Georgia State, it was mediocre. It wasn't horrible. He wasn't the main reason Tennessee lost that game. People were trying to kind of throw the blame on his shoulders. He wasn't great, but he wasn't the reason Tennessee lost that game. There's lack of effort, and the defense were the reasons why Tennessee ultimately lost that game. But against BYU, he was a huge reason Tennessee lost against the Cougars because for whatever reason, he was making mistakes that he hasn't made really maybe even his entire Tennessee career, not at the least since his redshirt freshman season in 2017. So it seemed like at the beginning of the year, and even a little bit at the very beginning of the UTC game, it seemed like he has regressed, and I don't know why that is, because you bring in Jim Chaney, who's really good at playing to the strengths of his offense, and and really making quarterbacks who struggled look better, and kind of figure out what can we do to mask their weaknesses here and get them to play better and do things that they weren't able to do with their careers. And I think part of that's also a learning curve because Guarantano, this is his 4th offensive coordinator in his 4 years at Tennessee. So he's had a different play caller every single year he's been at Tennessee. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. His development and his progression to start this season has been disappointing. But like I said, he does statistically, and from just watching him play on the road the last 2 seasons, he does play better on the road than he does at home. I think it kind of helps him to, I think he kind of feeds off a little bit of that hostility and stuff from the opposing fans and being in a hostile environment. I think he does feed off that a little bit because that's what you want about him. He's very tough and he's very competitive. So I think he does kind of feed off that some. But I mean, he hasn't been what Vol fans were kind of hoping and maybe expecting him to be. I don't think anyone was really expecting him to be, like an all SEC type of quarterback. But he definitely hasn't shown growth. If anything, he's shown some regression from last season.
Well, he certainly has some weapons on the outside at wide receiver with Jawan Jennings, who seems like he's been at Tennessee for forever, and then and Marquez Callaway as well. Those guys are given in what they do and how they can help Guarantano there. But is there another wide receiver we should watch for in helping those two?
Well, the other one I would say to keep an eye on would be Josh Palmer. He's a junior who has some big play threat. He hasn't really done a whole lot this season yet, but he's a guy that I would fully expect with this kind of speed and stuff he has. And, with Florida's secondary being, I would say definitely their weakness on defense. I'll be very intrigued to see what they use or how they use him. I would watch tight end Dominic Wood-Anderson. He has the big play potential from the tight end spot. I do imagine, though, that they'll be asking him and Austin Pope, the other main tight end that plays, they'll be using those two a lot for blocking Florida's front seven, because Tennessee's offensive line, I think, is going to have a lot of issues with what I think is a very good the Florida front seven. So I think you'll see when the tight ends are in there, I wish they'll be in there quite a bit. I expect them probably to be more used in the blocking game than the passing game. But we'll see. I think Wood-Anderson's one to keep an eye on. But I also would really watch, if you're a Florida fan, what Tennessee does with their running backs out of the backfield, because both Ty Chandler and true freshman Eric Gray are really good pass catching options. You haven't seen it a ton yet this year as far as them being used a whole lot in the passing game. I think they were used a little bit in the first game of the season, if I'm remembering the stats correctly. But both those guys are very shifty, especially Eric Gray. He, as a true freshman, he's shown a lot of playmaking ability, just for his shiftiness and the wiggle he has, and just his vision. Those are kind of the two guys I would really circle, outside the wide receivers, as guys that, whether it's going to be on screens or maybe even if Tennessee's kept it a little bland on their play calling on offense, there's a good chance you could maybe see one of those running backs, line up in the slot or something like that, and against, like I said, a Florida secondary that I think is prone to some big plays. I think those two might be even more than Josh Palmer. I think those two guys might be ones you want to watch out for in the passing game, is how Tennessee uses their running backs in the passing attack.
That's a good point, because Todd Grantham and Jim Chaney, went against each other last year, of course, with Florida Georgia, and Chaney used the running backs well there out of the backfield as well, and able to get those screen passes going, especially with this Florida defensive front and aggressive as they are. Definitely a point to watch out for there. Probably the biggest question mark, and you just kind of alluded to it a little bit heading into the matchup, is this Tennessee offensive line and how they handled the Florida pass rush, and maybe even trying to establish a run game as well. Have they settled on a starting five heading into the matchup, or is it still a little bit a mix and match for the first three games of the season?
I think after the UTC game, obviously that's against UTC, Tennessee should have been able to dominate up front in that game, and they did for the most part. I think after that game, they've settled on at least a group of 6 or 7 guys I trust. So maybe not quite exactly the same starting five you had against UTC will be the same one you see against Florida. But I think in that game they found 5 guys who they started in that game, because one of their typical starters, Jameer Johnson, was kind of banged up, so they didn't want to risk it against an inferior opponent. But I think he found those 5, and then Jameer Johnson and probably Marcus Tatum, who's your most experienced tackle. I think they've, like I said, they haven't settled on the starting 5. They've settled on a group of 6 or 7 guys who are the ones they're going to play the most. And whether that's, whoever starts may not be the guy who's playing in the fourth quarter, who they go to in crunch time. But I think you have 2 true freshmen, and Wanya Morris and Donald Wright, who I think they found when they liked them. They're going to play them a lot. They also found a guy who is older than those 2, but from an experience standpoint has just as much experience as them, in Kayron Calvert, because he hasn't played his first couple years in Tennessee because of injuries and stuff. But he's finally started to play some this year, and he looked very good at the right tackle spot for Tennessee against UTC. Granted, that was against UTC, but he gives them a really good a guy who can kind of steal the edge a little bit out there on running plays, because he played guard a lot in high school and has played guard mostly at Tennessee so far. But they put him at tackle, and he's a little raw from a pass blocking perspective, which where he's against Florida. But they do like him from there. So you also have Brandon Kennedy, who's a veteran from Alabama, who's finally healthy and playing over Tennessee, and then you have Trey Smith, obviously the everyone knows who he is, and he's really good at that left guard spot. I think, like I said, you have 5 or 6 or 7 guys that I think they're going to play and will play most of the game. I'm very worried about Wanya Morris, Donna Wright, Kayron Calvert. Whether they start or not, they're going to be having their first road trip, their first road start, or their first major road experience. And it's not just any road game. It's not like you're playing a Big 12 team or a Pac-12 team or whatever that doesn't have a vaunted front seven. I mean, you can make a case so far at the beginning of the season that Florida's front seven is the best front seven in the SEC. And if you have the best front seven in the SEC, you probably have the best front seven in the entire college football. So it's going to be. I don't have a lot of confidence, or as much confidence as some people seem to have with Tennessee's offensive line heading into this game, because of they played well and it looks like they found a lot of guys against UTC. I'm going to have to see it before I believe it, but I do think they at least have 6 or 7 guys they do trust now, and you're not going to see you're not going to see 9 or 10 guys rotating in and out against the Gators on Saturday.
Yeah, almost similar to Florida's offensive line as well. They got 6, 7 guys they feel good about, but how how do they perform on the field is a different story. You know who the 6 or 7 are going to be, but how they perform, is up in the air. And for Florida, not too good in the run game, and we'll get to that in just a second too. But Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor of Rocky Top Insider, joining me here on Gators Breakdown as we move to the other side of the ball. Is the Tennessee defense viewing this game different now that Felipe Franks is out and the possibility of seeing both Kyle Trask and Emory Jones?
I'll be very intrigued to see that. We don't get to see, very much at all at practice, and I know you guys don't think you get to see anything at practice now that the season's going on. So, they like to close down practices and have state secrets in college football, from what I've noticed. But we don't get to see, a lot of preparation for what they do. So we have to go based on, what Coach Pruitt says and what the players and everything say about, how they're preparing and stuff. And I would imagine now, with what Dan Mullen said after the game on Saturday and what he said on Monday about, playing both guys, it'll be very interesting to me to see how Florida's offense runs, because, I thought they looked even better with Kyle Trask in there than they did with Felipe Franks on Saturday against Kentucky. And, that's not a huge observation. I think a lot of people could see that. But that was him. And Bill mentioned he thought about playing Emory Jones, but he didn't want to kind of disrupt the flow that Trask was in. I go back to when Tennessee played Georgia last year on the road in Athens. Obviously, Georgia wins that game because, they were just better than Tennessee across the board talent-wise. But Tennessee was actually in that game better than I thought they were going to be. And it was only I think a 12-point game early in the fourth quarter, and that was closer than I expected it to be. And part of that was because Georgia at the time, they were rotating in and out quarterbacks. You had Jake Fromm playing most of it, but then you would take him out and put in Justin Fields for a play or two. It just would kind of disrupt the rhythm on Georgia's offense, and that to me was one of the reasons why they didn't have a bigger lead and weren't playing as well as maybe they could have. I'll be very interested to see with Kyle Trask, this being his first career start at Florida. I think his first career start since early high school for him, because he wasn't the starter in his junior and senior year of high school. With this being his first start, how does he respond to being pulled out for a guy to come in and maybe run a series or run a couple of plays? I'll be very interested to kind of watch how Florida's offense plays out. It either has the potential to be really, really good and it works well, and you can draw those comparisons to the 2016 with Chris Leak and Tim Tebow, or it could go poorly and you could kind of disrupt Trask's confidence or maybe even disrupt Emory's confidence. And I don't know. I think Tennessee is definitely preparing for both of them, and maybe that was even some gamesmanship by Mullen and they don't play 2 guys. But I think Tennessee, you have to prepare differently because Trask is a very different type of player to what Felipe Franks is. And I don't know. To me, there's a lot of questions about Tennessee's defense and whether or not their defensive line can make a difference, and also whether or not Bryce Thompson is going to play. So there's a lot of questions on that defense anyway. But they definitely are going to have to prepare quite a bit differently, I think, for Florida's offense than what they would have had Franks been the starter. Because they played against Franks. They played against them. This coaching staff and players did last year. But obviously, a lot of the players on defense who were on the roster in 2017 played against him too. So they've never played against Trask except for he came in garbage time last year, but that doesn't really count. So I'll be very interested to see how Tennessee prepares, and also what Florida's offense does look like with him, and if they do use 2 quarterbacks, how that goes.
Yeah, and with Florida's problems in the run game, there's a chance we see Florida use their weapons on the outside even more. How does Tennessee stack up at defensive back to keep up with the depth of the Gators receivers?
Honestly, I don't like that matchup at all for Tennessee. If Bryce Thompson is, if he does play and he's ruled eligible to come back or whatever, however you want to word it, he does play, I like that matchup a little more for Tennessee. But even with him in there, Tennessee secondary hasn't been as good this season as I think a lot of us in the media and a lot of fans too were expecting, because you look at, you had obviously Bryce Thompson's been out for the first 3 games of the season because he's been suspended, but you had a freshman All-American coming back and Bryce Thompson. You had Lante Taylor, who looked really good as a freshman, even though he played wide receiver all in college and originally joined Tennessee as a receiver, converted him to cornerback, and he held his own. He did a good job in the SEC especially. And then you had a veteran and Najee Warrior back at safety, and then you had a guy in Trevon Flowers who, before his injury last year during Tennessee's bye week, was flashing some potential as a true freshman. This year, the stats won't necessarily show it, but they haven't been very good. There's been a lot of, obviously, the big thing you point to is the end of the BYU game when they give up the 60-plus yard gain that gave BYU the chance to kick that game-tying field goal. That was a mess up by Alontae Taylor, then a whiffed tackle by Nigel Warrior there that just let him gain another 20 yards. But even with that, just notwithstanding, they haven't been consistent. There were several times, even against UTC, where the Chattanooga receivers, they got open from their guy, whoever was covering them. But I mean, UTC had so many drops in that game. If they didn't drop it, then the quarterback just misfired for whatever reason. So Tennessee got, the stat sheet shows that they held UTC to under 100 yards passing. But when you were watching the game, you're saying, I mean, dang, these guys they're getting open. This UTC was dropping it. So I think, to me, whether it's Van Jefferson or if you look at Freddie Swain in the slot there, but that one concerns me the most because of his speed and his shiftiness, what he can do. Tennessee hasn't shown a very good ability to kind of, I guess, defend in the slot, because at least on the outside, at least you have the help of the boundary, you have the help of the the out of bounds, and you can kind of push there, you can kind of push them that way and then have that as your help. When you're in the middle of the field as a nickel corner, it's more difficult because maybe you have help from a safety, maybe you have help from a linebacker, but I mean, those guys aren't going to be able to cover the kind of speed that you have at the slot in the SEC. So I do not like that matchup for Tennessee, even if Bryce Thompson does play this game. And I think if Tennessee can't generate pressure, and they've had trouble getting pressure this season, whoever the quarterback is for Florida, they have a chance to, get the ball into the hands and make some plays on the outside.
One positive for this Tennessee defense was linebacker Daniel Batuli back on the field last week for the first time this season. What does his return mean to this Tennessee defense, and maybe what we can expect from him coming up against Florida?
I know it was against Chattanooga, but his return, it made a marked difference on how Tennessee was able to play and line up, and just the confidence I think the defense has. And he wasn't out there, a ton because
right.
The Tennessee that game got out of hand pretty quickly, and also they didn't want to play him a ton because they're still trying to make sure he's going to be okay from that after the knee procedure he had late in fall camp. But I think his return, it really, I don't think it can be understated. Or I don't think it can be said enough how much it could really mean to the defense. It doesn't mean that Tennessee's going to be, a top 5 SEC defense or anything like that, but I think it allows that front seven, especially in the linebacking core, where you've seen most of the issues with the kind of alignment and stuff like that. It's going to allow them to get better at that because he's the leader. He's a guy this is his 4th year. He's the middle linebacker. He's the quarterback of that defense. And it's also, it allows Henry To'oTo'o, the star freshman for Tennessee there in the middle. I think you're going to see Batuli and HT. I think you're going to see both those guys kind of be the starters. And maybe if they aren't, if Willig not the starter alongside Batuli, HT's still going to play a ton in this game. And I think it allows him to play more free. He doesn't have to worry about kind of making plays or calling out the plays and stuff like that because he has the leader beside him to do it. Whereas when the first couple weeks of the season, Henry To'oTo'o and Willig not both were kind of tasked with kind of running the plays and getting things set up. And that's a lot to ask for a freshman, even though he is a very good freshman. He's a very smart freshman, one of the smartest freshman linebackers I've ever seen. Yeah, it's still a lot to ask for a guy who this is his first year in this defense. So I think it'll help Tennessee's defense a lot having Batuli back. This is a game that's going to test that, but I think you saw a marked difference in how Tennessee handled their alignments and their assignments and stuff against UTC on Saturday. That's obviously Florida's a big step up from that, but I do think you saw quite a bit of difference with Batuli out there.
Kind of taking it off topic here. Lastly, Nathaniel, your Twitter bio says you're a Star Wars fanatic. I consider myself one somewhat as well. So, of course, you got to get down to Orlando and the new Star Wars theme park, Galaxy's Edge, down here in Orlando at Disney.
Man, I can't wait for it. I definitely want to go down there whenever football season ends, and maybe when there's a break during basketball season. I'm gonna try to go. But yeah, I am pumped about that for sure. That's on my to-do list.
I guess the biggest question is, of course, a new movie coming out December this year. How are your thoughts on the newer trilogy in relation to the previous Star Wars movies?
Oh, actually, I really like the new trilogy. I know it's not as popular with a lot of fans, but I actually do really like it. I would still obviously put the original trilogy ahead of it, but I think it's better than the prequels. And I'm not going to trash The Last Jedi like a lot of people have. I actually have genuinely enjoyed it. I've genuinely enjoyed the new trilogy, and I've actually really liked the the kind of standalone movies they did. I think Rogue One to me was one of the best Star Wars films I've ever seen. To me,
Okay,
it's in
we
my
agree
top.
there. Yep, we agree.
Yeah,
there.
probably my top three as far as one of the best Star Wars movies I've ever seen. Rogue One was phenomenal. But yeah, I am very excited about the kind of the ending of the Skywalker saga, and to see where Star Wars moves on from this, because this will be the ninth movie that covers the Skywalker family, and then they're kind of closing that chapter, closing that book, and I'll be very interested to see where they move on from after this.
Yeah, absolutely. And then of course, we're letting our nerd come out here too, but the Mandalorian show too coming out.
Yes.
Something to look forward to. If everybody hasn't checked the trailer out for that, then you like Star Wars, definitely something to look forward to.
Absolutely, I am very excited about that. That I was already going to get Disney Plus, but watching the trailers for that that sold me enough. I was like, I was already going to get this thing, but seeing these things, it makes me feel even better about getting that subscription service.
Absolutely. All right, that's Nathaniel Rutherford from Rocky Top Insider joining me right here on Gators Breakdown to preview the Tennessee Volunteers. Nathaniel, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Are you ready to bet on some football? MyBookie is the place to bet on football every week. Whether you want to make a national title bet or wager on this weekend's games, MyBookie has you covered. MyBookie is proven, and that's why they are always the right play. You bet, you win, they pay. Have some fun with betting this season. MyBookie lets you bet on which college coaches will get fired, who will make the college football playoff, or win the Heisman Trophy. You can even bet on halftime lines, live odds. If by the second half it looks like your bet is going to lose, you can always just take the other side. Also, MyBookie allows you to bet on FBS versus FCS games. Right now, double your first deposit at MyBookie. Use promo code Gators to activate the offer. Visit MyBookie online today at mybookie.ag. That's MYBOOKIE.ag. And don't forget to use promo code Gators when creating your account to claim the bonus. Bet, win, get paid at MyBookie. All right, here we go. The first SEC home game of the season and the first of 3 straight home games for the Gators. Tennessee is going to come in fired up, ready to turn around their season. They'll play with some desperation, some passion that may lead to some trickeration or some big plays the Gators will have to be ready for. I know some of you out there don't necessarily consider Tennessee much of a rival anymore, but I definitely do. I know their fan base does. I know their players do. Their coaching staff does. So hopefully the swamp is rocking and everyone's in their blue, ready to go at noon on Saturday. Of course, the big question will be, how does Kyle Trask and maybe even Emory Jones react to getting more playing time? There's still not really enough tape on these guys for an opponent to pick up too much on tendencies. So Florida still has some element of surprise with the quarterback situation. Can Kyle Trask pick up where he left off versus Kentucky? The offensive play calling, to me, doesn't really change all that much with him compared to Felipe Franks. What to watch here is, how does Jeremy Pruitt build his defensive game plan versus Kyle Trask and or Emory Jones or whoever's out there. I think we'll see both of them. I think we saw enough last week that just sitting in zone isn't going to work versus Kyle Trask. So I expect Pruitt to be aggressive, especially versus a quarterback that doesn't have much experience, and see if you can rattle him early on. Make Kyle Trask beat you. Don't let him beat you has to be the mindset there. So, no matter how Kyle Trask plays, we could still see plenty of Emory Jones. I really do think we see him a good bit in this game, unless Kyle Trask just really comes out, firing again. So, go back to the first game of the season for Tennessee and just how much the Georgia State quarterback was able to kill Tennessee's defense with read option and zone read type of plays. And you may have something cooking with Jones. To test this Tennessee defense, when Jones first goes out there, to me, I try and sneak a big play with him early through the air. I think most expect him to be a run threat, especially given the trouble Tennessee had in stopping that style. So maybe there's a chance here to sneak in a big play early on. Not sure the confidence we have in this Florida run game with the running backs and offensive line, but while Tennessee gave up 213 yards to Georgia State, they rebounded nicely versus BYU, where the Cougars only had only had 138 yards gained on the ground in that one. So they did bounce back nice from an opponent they should have beat to a opponent that was a lot tougher matchup, but they did make necessary adjustments to stop the run game. So for Florida, will giving Emory Jones more carries open up the run game and take some stress off the offensive line? Or will it be Kyle Trask coming out and slinging it early that'll help open up the run game? Either way, we know this offensive line will have to improve on their assignments and physicality to get it going in spots and help these running backs out. For the Gators defense, the matchup outside with cornerbacks versus Tennessee's wide receivers, Juwan Jennings and Marquez Callaway is the matchup I'm really looking for. That duo for Tennessee has 6 of the 7 receiving touchdowns for Tennessee so far this season. Jennings has 4 of those, and we haven't got to see Marco Wilson and C.J. Henderson together the last 2 years under Mullen, and that could continue again Saturday. C.J. Henderson was at practice Tuesday, dressed out, but no idea how much he participated. So if he's out or limited, it'll be Marco Wilson, who hasn't looked like himself yet this season, and one of the true freshmen on the other side. And last week it was a non-favorable matchup, size-wise, for Wilson versus Ahmad Wagner. But you have Callaway for Tennessee at 6'2", 204, Jennings at 6'3", 208, and Wagner was much more of an issue there size-wise, 6'5", 234. But these two Tennessee wide receivers aren't small and do have a lot of experience coming in to Gainesville here. So, of course, the easiest way to stop that is put pressure on Jarrett Garantano to where he can't get enough passes off. The Florida defensive front will try to bounce back after not getting a whole lot of pressure last week versus Kentucky. Tennessee has given up 5 sacks on the season so far and is yet to see anything like this defensive front for the Gators. That could be without Jabari Zuniga, who was seen in a boot earlier this week, Tuesday at practice, and Ventrell Miller, who was in a red no-contact jersey as well. So I still like what Florida has options there with Grenard and Moon, but pass rush isn't the same, especially without Zuniga on the field. So also, kind of injury-wise, Amari Burney did practice. So if Miller is limited or can't go, then it looks like you'll get to see more from Amari Burney after he missed the last 2 games with an injury. Now, I honestly don't know how this game's going to go. There's so many things up in the air, especially with the switch at quarterback and some of the injury situations we find ourselves in for these Gators right now. Florida is the better team. Florida's best is much better than Tennessee's best. Tennessee's worst is worse than Florida's worst. But Tennessee will come in upset-minded no matter what happened those first 2 games. Tennessee isn't as bad as they look versus Georgia State, but they certainly were that day. I do think Mullen gets creative or gets the pass game going early on to jump quick on Tennessee. Injuries on the defensive side of the ball keeps this from being a rout. But I like the Gators here, 27-13. The defensive line won't get insane pressure on Garantano, but they'll get enough to make a difference. Gators 27, Tennessee 13 is my score prediction. I don't think Florida runs away with it, but they do control Tennessee pretty much the whole game. All right, we'll take a look at games of interest around here. We'll start right in the SEC. At noon as well, Southern Miss visits Alabama. Not much of a game there. Also at noon, at a conference matchup, Cal and Ole Miss up in Oxford, Mississippi. 23rd ranked Cal coming in and taking on Matt Corral and the Ole Miss Rebels. LSU visits Vanderbilt as LSU's schedule gets a kind of get a break here before before Florida travels to Baton Rouge in just a few weeks. So LSU get past Vanderbilt here, and they'll probably be coasting to Florida when they match up. The 3:30 CBS game this week, SEC's game of the week, is Auburn and Texas A&M. Number 8 Auburn, number 17 Texas A&M Aggies in College Station. There, be interesting to see how this one plays out. Of course, most Gator fans want a pretty big game when Auburn comes to town in just a couple weeks. So if Auburn has to get past Texas A&M first, as I mentioned, that game is at 3:30. Also in the SEC at 4 o'clock, Kentucky, Florida's opponent last week, and Mississippi State. Both teams coming off losses there, so definitely want to bounce back this week. Also at 4, another SEC East matchup, South Carolina and Missouri. Pretty good quarterback battle going there with Kelly Bryant and Ryan Helinski. See which one of those guys comes out on top, and might be who can kind of, challenge Kentucky here in this game for who's kind of pegged between Florida and Georgia in the East. 7:30 that night, San Jose and Arkansas State in Arkansas. And, of course, the big one, number 7 Notre Dame visits Athens as they take on the Bulldogs at 8 o'clock on CBS. So if you're going to the Gator game, you'll be home in time. Most of you will be home in time to see Georgia and Notre Dame in the national game of the week there. So kind of the first test for Georgia, and we'll see what they have as they going up against the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SCC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.